Welcome back to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Russia in the past 24 hours. The biggest story today is Russia's effort to turn sanctions enforcement at sea into a global confrontation. Vladimir Putin says Moscow will respond in kind if European countries seize Russian commercial vessels. He also says the response could come wherever Russia considers it necessary, including far from the original detention. That language matters because it expands the risk map. European governments have focused on tankers accused of helping Russia evade restrictions. Moscow is now suggesting that a boarding in one theater could justify action against a ship connected to that country somewhere else. The Pacific Fleet setting sharpened the message. Its commander said Russian forces were ready to inspect and detain vessels associated with countries Moscow calls unfriendly. He also said the fleet had monitored more than 1,000 ships along the Kurils from April through August, including 379 linked to unfriendly states. Those figures show the surveillance picture the Kremlin wants everyone to see. They remain unverified Russian claims. Russia is presenting its navy as a worldwide enforcement arm for its response to Western sanctions. The strategic consequence is straightforward. Commercial shipping now faces a greater chance of being used as leverage between governments. A Russian inspection or diversion could be calibrated below open conflict, yet still raise insurance costs, force escorts, and test how far Europe will defend sanctions enforcement at sea. That brings us to Novorossiysk, where military pressure and commercial restraint collided in the same port. Ukraine says it struck Russia's main remaining Black Sea naval stronghold with jet-powered drones, Neptune missiles, and unmanned boats. The targets included air defenses, piers, and port infrastructure. Grain operations were interrupted, and Russian authorities reported civilian deaths, injuries, and residential damage during the wider raid. Ukraine reached a heavily defended naval and export hub more than 300 kilometers from the front. The full damage picture remains incomplete. Keep that battlefield detail in proportion, because the political constraint around it may be more important. Washington reportedly asked Ukraine to stop attacking tankers and infrastructure tied to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. That route carries Kazakh oil through Novorossiysk and includes major Western commercial interests. Ukraine reportedly agreed to spare that infrastructure and non-Russian ships unless they were sanctioned or carrying Russian cargo. At the same time, it kept the freedom to hit Russian naval assets at the port. That's a remarkably specific line around target selection. It tells us the U.S. can still shape parts of Ukraine's long-range campaign when global energy stability is at stake. It also tells us Kyiv is trying to preserve military pressure without alienating partners whose oil and companies share the same geography. One port now holds Russian naval power, Kazakh exports, Western investment, and Ukrainian strike access. That's quite a crowded chessboard. Ukraine's deep strike campaign also reached the Orsk refinery, roughly 1,900 kilometers from the border. The facility stopped processing after an attack and can handle about 115,000 barrels per day. The distance reinforces a pattern. Industrial depth is becoming less protective. The duration of the outage remains unclear. At the diplomatic level, Ukraine says it passed proposals to the American side. U.S. envoys are expected to engage Kyiv and Moscow, but there is no disclosed text, no Russian acceptance, and no agreed sequence. The channel is active, while a settlement remains out of reach. The more revealing connection is between negotiations and pressure. Washington is shaping limits around commercial targets. Kyiv is asking for air defense and continuing deep strikes. Moscow is threatening shipping beyond Europe while preparing for what both sides describe as a longer war. The domestic political environment is visibly tightening. Ukraine says Russian internal documents point to another large mobilization after the September parliamentary election. That figure remains an unverified Ukrainian intelligence claim. Russia's Supreme Court barred Yabloko, the country's only registered anti-war party, from the election. The party says it will appeal. Its ceasefire platform offered one of the few legal ways for voters to register opposition to the war, and some Russians publicly criticized the court's decision. Removing that outlet makes the election more controlled at the same moment the Kremlin may need consent for more manpower. It also lets the state present every permitted party as broadly aligned with continued war. That is less about an electoral surprise and more about narrowing the range of acceptable public choice. There was one carefully chosen diplomatic release. Russia freed former U.S. Marine Robert Gilman on humanitarian grounds after his health deteriorated severely. Officials said there was no prisoner exchange. That gesture can create goodwill with Washington without changing Russia's military or political position. It shows the Kremlin can lower one bilateral irritant while escalating pressure somewhere else. Selective flexibility is part of the leverage strategy. So the through line today is reach. Russia is extending a maritime threat from Europe into the Pacific. Ukraine is extending strike access into naval and energy nodes deep inside Russia. Washington is reaching into target selection while negotiations continue without a public framework. Watch for the first real maritime enforcement move because speeches are still cheaper than boardings. Also, watch whether Moscow acknowledges Ukraine's proposals and whether any narrow agreement emerges around shipping, energy, or long-range strikes. Those limited arrangements may tell us more about the state of diplomacy than another round of broad peace language. Thanks for listening. Keep your maps open, your sources skeptical, and your notifications on. For the written brief, find us at restrictedhandling.substack.com. See you tomorrow.